Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Clean Water webinar. We'll get started here in just a couple of moments. So while we're waiting, if you want to put in the chat what watershed you are currently in, we'd love to know a little bit about you. So again, put in the chat what watershed you are currently in. I guess the Q&A rather. I guess our chat is disabled right now. Let's see. So put in the Q&A what watershed you're tuning in from today. Okay, so we're seeing lots of people, South Fork, Shenandoah, the Muddy Branch, Cedar River watershed in Mississippi, York County watershed, Newfound Lake watershed, Neshaminy Creek, Northwest Branch, Doan Brook, Blanchard River watershed, Rocky River, Patapsco, Upper Chartiers Creek, Little Falls watershed, Big Sioux watershed, Bush River, Maryland, folks from all over the place. So again, if you want to put in the Q&A where you are located, what watershed you're tuning in from today. Tacony watershed, James River, Middle Cedar, Potomac River, Schuylkill, the Rouge. Awesome. Okay, so we will get started today with our webinar. So hello and everyone, welcome to the Clean Water webinar, taking a closer look at road salt pollution in the environment. My name is Abby Heilman and I am the Salt Watch Coordinator at the Isaac Walton League of America. I'm joined today by two experts, Dr. Amy Downing from Ohio Wesleyan University, and joining us a bit later is Dr. Sujay Koshal from the University of Maryland. And I'll do a little bit more of a detailed introduction for both of them later in the presentation. So as some housekeeping during this webinar, we're planning on holding some time at the end to answer some questions. So we ask that you hold your questions, put them in the Q&A, or if you can't wait, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, but put the name of the panelist who would like to answer your questions, since there will be 3 of us on today. This webinar is also being recorded, and you'll be able to find the recording on our website, which is www.saltwatch.org under webinars from experts, and then also on the Isaac Walton League's YouTube channel. As we go along, I also wanted to note that I will be using the words salt and chloride interchangeably throughout my portion of the webinar. And I do want to mention that although road salt is the biggest contributor to chloride pollution in the environment, there are other sources such as water softener discharge that also contribute to that pollution issue. So the Salt Watch program was launched in 2018 after a road salt spill was discovered outside of our national office headquarters in Gaithersburg, Maryland. The salt spill was next to a storm drain that led directly to the Muddy Branch, which is a local waterway that drains into the Potomac River. After sorting out who had jurisdiction over the salt spill, the salt was removed, but unfortunately not before the chloride levels in the Muddy Branch spiked to pretty toxic levels overnight. The goals of the Salt Watch program to raise awareness in the general public about the connection between salt and stream or public health, to identify chloride hotspots in freshwater, and to advocate for smarter salt application of road salt by sharing results with private landowners and local and state agencies. We use salt in the winter to keep us safe, but too much salt can impact our wildlife, habitats, infrastructure, and even our drinking water. So what really is road salt, or some organizations term it as winter salt? There's 4 different types. There's sodium chloride, which is the most common and least expensive, potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, and then also calcium chloride. Salt works by lowering the freezing temperature of water, and different kinds of salt or salt mixes can melt at different temperatures. At a certain temperature, these products stop working. Sodium chloride, for instance, only works down to about 15 degrees. So it's important to switch to something else that does work, or to switch to something like sand, which gives you traction. Regardless of what you use, though, it is important to follow best practices and to sweep up excess materials after a storm event to prevent additional pollution or sedimentation issues, depending on what you're using. And then also, since we are in the winter months, how are we seeing salt applied? Salt is typically applied in one of 2 ways, either as a granular or as a liquid. Granular applications of salt are what we are used to seeing, like what's in the left picture there, and is usually something that is used after there's already ice and snow on the ground. This application is known as de-icing. A practice that many applicators are starting to use more of is called anti-icing, which is shown in the right photo, where they actually spray a brine treatment on the roadway or sidewalk before an anticipated winter event. This prevents precipitation from forming a bond and creating icy conditions. It's a salt solution, so it uses less salt than an granular application. And it also stays on the pavement, unlike the granular application, which tends to bounce off, sometimes even when it's being applied. The anti-icing or brine application looks like stripes, again in the right photo, or some organizations call them safety stripes. If you see those stripes on the roadway, you know that your local Department of Transportation is doing what they can to lower the amount of salt that they're putting into the environment. So those stripes are really good things to see. They're trying to apply less salt. And I wanted to share this graphic. This is a really great graphic from Wisconsin SaltWise. I don't want to get into too much about how salt affects the environment, as Dr. Amy Downing and Dr. Koshal will talk about a little bit later. But I do want to mention that because salt is very persistent in the environment, it doesn't go away once you put it down. And it only takes 1 teaspoon of salt to permanently pollute 5 gallons of water. So just a little bit of salt goes a really long way. And I also realize, as we noticed in the Q&A, that not everybody is from the Maryland area, but I did want to show these 2 really great graphics from WSSC Water, which is one of the largest water and wastewater utilities in the nation. They supply water to over 2 million people in Maryland. They've been taking chloride data over the past 30 years, and they've noticed a 260% increase in the amount of salt or chloride in the Patuxent River Reservoir over the past 30 years, and a 200% increase in salt or chloride in the Potomac River over the past 30 years. And I did also want to mention here that many wastewater treatment centers, they do not have the funding, equipment, or the capability to remove chloride from the water. So the more salt that we're using, the bigger the problem can get. And so that brings me to people who are making a really big difference, all of our volunteers. Even if it's some small actions that they're taking, those actions really, really do go a long way. So far this year, our volunteers have submitted over 700 pledges to us stating how they plan to reduce road salt in their community. And this word cloud is a result of many of the recurring themes that our volunteers have pledged within their communities to reduce salt. So reduce salt use, in some cases eliminate salt use, monitor local waterways, educate others, use alternatives, sweep up extra salt, encourage others, one of my favorites, driving less, lots of different options and great ideas that they've come up with to reduce road salt in their community. Part of combating road salt pollution is learning about what is happening in our own backyards. As part of our program, we distribute free chloride testing kits to anyone who is interested in testing local waterways for road salt pollution. Waterways such as surface waters like streams, creeks, ponds, lakes, those types of things. The Salt Watch kit is sent in an envelope in the mail, and it includes 4 chloride testing strips, sample test instructions, a conversion chart for converting your Quantab strip or chloride strip to parts per million, and then also data uploading instructions, how to report that data to us. And when should you monitor? Many of our volunteers monitor consistently throughout the year, whether that's once a week, twice a month, once a month. That's really great to see. But some volunteers also, they only have time to go out 4 times during the winter, and that's okay too. If you're going out just 4 times, we ask that you go before a winter weather event to get a baseline reading, after the first winter storm when salt has been applied to the roadways, after the first thaw or rainstorm of the winter, and then after the next rain event to get some of those readings. And I wanted to share some of the data from this year. So this is the 2022-2023 season so far. We have almost 2,000 data points, and that's from 19 states and DC. How we're looking at some of this data, we're scoring it between 0 and 30 parts per million, 30 and 100 parts per million, 100 and 230 parts per million, and above 230 parts per million. Many streams naturally are only between 0 and 30 parts per million. Other streams can be as high as 100 parts per million. So as the samples that we've received so far, 30% have been below 30 parts per million, or 30 parts per million less, and then 46% have been still within that natural range below 100 parts per million for some of those streams. Above 100 parts per million, it gets out of those natural levels that we're seeing. So 17% are above 100 parts per million, but still below 230 parts per million. And then 7% of the samples that we've received so far this season have been considered toxic. And so that means toxic to a lot of the macroinvertebrates. And Amy will talk about this a little bit more, I'm sure. Above 230 parts per million, again, 7% we've seen so far in the US, just from this season. So starting in July until yesterday's data, actually. And I did want to put out a little call to action. We were quite a bit ahead of last year's reports and data, but now, unfortunately, we are 7% behind this time last year. So if you haven't gone out and monitored yet, we're still seeing high chloride levels across the United States, even if you haven't had any storm events. So please go out and monitor whenever you can so we can keep getting those readings throughout the year. A question that we commonly get is how much salt should actually be applied. We're used to seeing photos like on the left, which is salt dumped to prevent slips and falls, but sometimes the amount of salt that we're putting down can actually contribute to slips and falls because of excess salt used. More salt does not mean more melting, and salt is also not meant to be used as traction. We need to use salt to stay safe during the winter, but we need to be more mindful about our salt usage. Salt should be applied more like what is in the right photo, pun intended. Salt should be sprinkled, leaving about 3 inches of space between granules, allowing that salt to work. And this is an overhead view of the last picture that was on the right. So salt can be spread out and it will still work. If you see a salt spill or would like some more resources to get the word out, maybe talk to some folks in your community government, we do have a page on our website dedicated to this. It's additional resources, advocacy resources under the What You Can Do page on our website, which is www.saltwatch.org. So you can go there to learn a little bit more about some things you can do to get the word out. And the more that we know about what is happening around us, such as testing through Salt Watch, the more informed decisions we can make to limit road salt pollution across the country. Your advocacy actions, no matter how small, even if it's talking to a neighbor, can make a really huge difference and put road salt in the news more and more each year. These articles are actually from this year's news sources across the country. The more we talk about it, the more that we can make a difference. And I wanted to finish up my presentation by showing this slide. There are some really simple things that we can do to make a difference in road salt pollution. You can shovel early and often to clear walkways before snow turns to ice. Scatter salt, a 12-ounce mug, like this one right here. You can see it, holds enough salt to treat a 20-foot long driveway or 10 sidewalk squares. And then you can also sweep up excess salt and reuse it during the next salting or during the next winter weather event. And we do ask that you are mindful about your salting and that you salt responsibly to protect our drinking water, habitats, wildlife, infrastructure, vehicles, and pets. For more information about Salt Watch, please visit www.saltwatch.org. And if you have any questions or would like to request bulk kits, you can email me at saltwatch@iwla.org. And now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Amy Downing. Amy is a freshwater ecologist and a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Ohio Wesleyan University. Amy's research and teaching interests center around understanding the role of biodiversity in ecosystems. She has been involved in several international collaborations that explore the effects of biodiversity loss on ecosystems, and more recently, the response of freshwater communities to salinization due to road salt runoff. She is also fortunate to be able to teach students through travel learning courses that have taken her and her students around the world to observe and learn about the Earth's biodiversity. So Amy, I'll pass it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Abby, and for everyone who is attending today's webinar. I really appreciate the invitation to talk with all of you today from my perspective as a freshwater biologist who's really pretty recently just begun to explore the effects of road salt pollution in freshwater ecosystems. Most of the work I'm going to talk about today is part of an international collaboration, and I think the story of how that collaboration began is worth sharing because it shares some similarities to the collaborative efforts of the Salt Watch program. So to begin, freshwater biologists have been studying the effects of salt in freshwater ecosystems for some time. This isn't new research, but for example, scientists might report negative effects of salt from a single lake study or from an experiment focusing on a single species. And it left a lot of unanswered questions about how broad some of the effects of freshwater salinization might be, around larger spatial scales. So during a scientific conference that was filled with freshwater biologists, because it was called the Limnology and Oceanography Conference, brings together people who work in water systems from all over the world, freshwater biologists kind of got together and started casually talking about how perhaps a more coordinated effort might help us better understand the extent to which salt might have effects on freshwater ecosystems. So that small group of scientists decided to send out an email to a broader network of freshwater scientists to see if we might be interested in collaborating on a more coordinated exploration of this problem. And this is really where I came in. I was one of the recipients of those emails. And the idea was to bring together a bunch of freshwater biologists who are all capable of doing sort of replicated experiments so that we could all do the same experiment across many sites at the same time using the same methodology to look at the broader impacts of salt on freshwater ecosystems. So I was excited to join this project, even though it wasn't really my particular area of expertise at the time, as was the case for a lot of people who joined in on this project. Certainly, it's a really interesting problem. It's a very timely problem. And also, I knew I could find a team of undergraduate students at Ohio Wesleyan who would be eager to help contribute to the work. So I signed on with a lot of other folks to sort of involve in this research. So the next slide will show how many people we're talking about. So these are 3 papers that came out last year, sort of early to mid-year. And you can see the long list of authors in all cases illustrates the extent to which this was an extremely collaborative project. And in a lot of ways, I feel like that is quite similar to the SaltWatch program. The strength of the SaltWatch program is in part due to the sheer number of people across many different areas that are contributing data on salt concentrations. So next slide will help. I don't really need to do much here because Abby did such a great job, and we're talking to people who already are knowledgeable of the problem. But clearly, when we add salt to our roadways, it has an unintended consequence of making its way into our freshwater systems, streams, also lakes and ponds, which are in some ways more susceptible because the water doesn't flush out, but salt can tend to accumulate in those kinds of systems more readily. Also, there are other sources of salt. Another big one is our use of various chemicals and fertilizers on agricultural systems, which in the Midwest here is a big one, because when that stuff runs off, it also increases salt in freshwater systems. So next slide. So this is also just a real general figure showing that this problem isn't going away. It's really only getting worse. This is, if you look from like 1970s till about today, you can see that the level at which and the rate at which we're applying road salt is increasing. So we're using more and more, and that helps partially explain why we're seeing more of the salt ending up in our freshwater systems. Next slide. So the work I'm going to talk about is really focusing on one particular aspect of freshwater food webs. So you can see on sort of one side of the slide, there's the artistic version of a food web. At the bottom, you have algae and plants, the primary producers. The algae or microscopic plants are eaten by small organisms, shown there by sort of the Daphnia. So small zooplankton. Those blue arrows then show that those little Daphnia are fed on by small fish and then larger fish and so on. In lakes and ponds especially, those plankton communities, the microscopic algae and microscopic herbivores, the zooplankton, are kind of the bulk of where the energy comes into the system, and this major transfer up the food web through the zooplankton. And so the work that I'm going to talk about today is really focusing on the plankton communities, the zooplankton, which are the herbivores that feed on the phytoplankton. So but it has impacts across sort of broader, the broader food web and food chain. Next slide. So what the heart of this, the results that I'm going to show you come from this coordinated effort across, it turns out, 16 sites around the world, and I'll have a map that shows you where those are in a few slides. And so the idea here is to gather or bring together all of these freshwater ecologists who are used to doing experiments like the ones that are shown in these slides, either in lake enclosures or in tanks that are maintained next to a lake or a pond. And the lake enclosures, there's some sort of a structure that sits on top of, floats on top of the water, and then you attach like a big plastic bag that you tie at the bottom, and you fill those enclosures or bags with the water from that lake and the plankton communities from that lake. And as you can see in the picture, you can replicate. So you can have multiple sort of miniature versions of the lake that you can then manipulate, things like salt concentrations. You can do the same thing on land. There you usually have to use some sort of a pump system to pull water from the natural body of water into the tanks. But similarly, then you add the plankton communities and you have replication that you can then work with. So the next slide. So this is just a picture or a map of the sites that were involved in this particular study. So there was a research team at each site. So you can see that the sites range from over in California to a lot of sites around the Great Lakes. In the Midwest, the one that says Krause, that's where I'm located here. It's Krause Nature Preserve, is owned by Ohio Wesleyan. You can also see that there's some in the northeastern United States and also southeastern Canada. And then we also had some European sites, 1 in Spain and 3 in Sweden. So you can see it really was this international collaboration across a wide range of sites, all places that use road salt to some degree to maintain roadways. So this is a problem in all cases. The California site was high up in the mountains. Next slide. So this looks a little complicated, but I'll kind of walk you through it. This is essentially just the experimental design. And what we did at each site is sites had either 20 enclosures or tanks or 30, just depended on how many a particular site could maintain. And the idea was to set up these enclosures or tanks and then create a gradient of salt from either 0 up to 1,500 milligrams of chloride per liter. And that's sort of shown in those rectangles. And the 0 to 200 scale is just kind of blown up below. So you can see we had lots of replication at the 0 to 200 level, and then it was a little bit more spaced out from 200 to 1,500. And depending on whether you had 20 or 30, you spaced out the chloride gradients slightly differently. The other thing to point out on the slide are those 3 lines that say Canada, US, and Europe. Those indicate the levels at which those various governments have deemed is a safe amount of salt to be in freshwater ecosystems, either for the safety of the environment itself or the safety of the humans who might be relying on that water for drinking water. You can see there's a range from about 120 up to about 250 in Europe. Europe doesn't really have consistent guidelines, but it's approximately where various groups land with their chloride guidelines. So the next slide, I just tried to put into context for those who are actively collecting data with the SaltWatch program. You can kind of see where those salt gradients fall on the little card that you use. So the 1 indicates sort of where that Canada limit is, and the 2 and 3 indicate where the sort of safe limit is considered to be in the USA and Europe. So you can see that that you may or may not be finding sites in your particular area that fall within that span. Next slide. Okay, so this is the result from one site. This happens to be the site from Krauss. So this is the work that came directly out of my research team. And there's a lot going on in this figure. So I was going to walk you through this one figure, make sure we kind of understand the take-home points here, and then expand it to show you the results from all 16 sites. So if we start on the x-axis, so along that chloride axis, you can see there, that's the gradient we established experimentally from 0 to 1,500. And we had usually each site had some replication at each level, but you had that gradient. Each one of those dots then is sort of a result from one tank or one enclosure. The black line, the black dots are the cladoceran abundance. Cladoceran is just a specific type of zooplankton. I have a picture of Daphnia over there, which is one example of a cladoceran. They're the bigger herbivores that do more of the grazing. So the y-axis in the black numbers relates to zooplankton. So you can see that black line goes down as chloride increases, which means that the zooplankton are declining at high levels of chloride. And note the scale, it's a little weird on that y-axis. It's partly covered, but it says 10 to the 0 up to 10 to the 1.5. That's just a log scale, but it also means it's not linear. So 10 to the 0 is the same as one organism per liter, and 10 to the 1.5 is like 30 organisms per liter, but it's not sort of a linear, it's a log scale. So you can see down by the time you get to 1,500, there's almost no zooplankton left in those tanks. The green line, it corresponds to algae, how much phytoplankton is there. And you can see it increases, its scale is in those green numbers on the other side of the y-axis. You can see algae increases with chloride. And it's not because we think that algae like salt, but it's really because all of the herbivores are gone. And so there's nothing left to eat all the algae. So it tends to grow at higher levels when there's more salt around. The final thing to point out on this graph is there's that dotted red line that's vertical, and that red line is intersecting with the black line at exactly 50% of the total number of zooplankton. So like I said, because that Y scale is a log scale and not an arithmetic scale, it's not halfway down the axis, but you can just trust me that where the red line and the black line intersect is where 50% of the zooplankton individuals have been gone from compared to what was at no salt. So how to interpret that? If you follow that red line down to the x-axis, it falls at around 250. That means by the time you get to 250 milligrams of chloride in this particular site, you've lost half of the animals that are the small microherbivores in this system. So that's an important number. So the next slide shows you the results from all of the sites. So like I said, it's a lot, but we've sort of walked our way through it. You can see Krause is there in that second row, third column. So that was the result we just looked at. And now here are all, well, actually only 15 sites. I've covered one up, but the results are the same. If you look across every site, that black line, which is the zooplankton, is declining in all cases as you increase chloride. So in all sites, zooplankton kind of disappear at high levels of chloride. And in most cases, that green line goes up. So you see as the herbivores decline, you see more algae result. So that's sort of result one. While there's some variation from site to site, certainly, and some of the shapes are a little bit different, the general trend holds true across all sites. The second thing to pay attention to is that red line, that red dotted line. The panels are ordered from the most sensitive sites to the least sensitive, because you can see, for example, paint, that first one in the upper left, it falls down at around 100 milligrams of chloride. That means at that site, at 100 milligrams of chloride per liter, half of the individuals were gone, were the zooplankton, half of them were dead. And if you kind of scale across that, the highest ones down at the bottom, Erkin and convict, you could get up to closer to 1,000 milligrams of chloride before you lost half of the organisms. So one sort of thing to observe is that there is a lot of variation in terms of how different sites were handling the salt. But if you look across all sites, the words on sort of the screen there that I wrote, 73% of these sites showed that you lost 50% or more of the animals at chloride levels that are either at or below what are considered these guidelines set by Europe, Canada, and the United States. Meaning at 250 milligrams or below, at most of these sites, we already lost 50% of the organisms. So next slide. So if you kind of think of this in the context of the food web, right, I've got a big X there, well, it's small x through the Daphnia. What's happening as we add road salts or salt in general to these systems is we're kind of removing those herbivores that are this really important link between the algae and the higher members of the food chain. Next slide. And the title of the paper, the first one that came out, right, is that the current water quality guidelines across North America and Europe do not protect lakes from salinization. So the idea is if we allow our freshwater systems to get up to those levels of 250 milligrams of chloride per liter, in most cases, we'll already have lost half the animals that are really important in bringing that energy up the food chain. So that was sort of the punchline and the essence behind that particular result. So there's a lot more complexity behind the work that this group did, and there are a couple other papers that have come out from this work. But we don't have that much time, and you guys aren't probably interested in all the weedy details. But if you are, the references are there in the first slide of the webinar, so you can go back and dig around yourself. But I thought I would tell you just a little bit more about some of the ongoing work that has in part come out of this collaboration. So the next slide. So this collaboration is really still ongoing, and it has taken some of the results we found from our first project, the tank and lake ecosystem experiments, and we've scaled it down to do things in the lab, because what we're interested now in is we see that there's variation from one species to another, from one site to another, and we're trying to understand what might be explaining that variation and how much variation might there be with respect to salt tolerance. So we're looking particularly at this one species, Daphnia. It's a really important herbivore. And the nice thing about this little guy is you can collect it in the field and put it in a little test tube in the lab, and they're asexual. They produce by cloning. So you just can put one little female in there and she'll produce lots of babies. And so you can get many Daphnia that grow in the lab, and you can grow the algae to feed them. And so they work really well as little lab organisms. And then you can put them in tubes. So you can put like one Daphnia in a little test tube as shown in that diagram. And you can increase salt in those test tubes from low amounts to high amounts. And you can quantify exactly at what concentration of salt you see what the sort of standard is, 50% of the animals dying. That's something we call the LC50, or the least concentration of lethality, essentially. And so I have just a preliminary result over there just to say that the results are just coming in right now, but this is work that people are doing at all these different sites, looking at genetic diversity and site diversity to see how much variation is there in salt tolerance. So one more slide before I finish up. Another project or another sort of angle that I and others are taking, this is some pretty preliminary work from my lab with my undergraduates, but we've been surveying some of our local environments, and we have a nice little oxygen probe. So you stick it in, you get a digital reading, and it tells you how much chloride is there. And so you can see some sites around where I am here in Columbus, Ohio area. We have sites that have almost no salt and sites that have very high amounts of salt. This is sort of winter readings. These sites over on the high end of 1500 are sites that are collecting road runoff and parking lot runoff. And so it's not surprising that they're that high. But what we are doing is surveying them and looking at the plankton communities. And this one result I show here, it shows that there's a trend, at least. We need some more data to be more thorough about it, but that the number of types of zooplankton, so the diversity of zooplankton, goes down as you increase chloride, meaning just the different species can't all persist in those high levels, and you see just a decline in the diversity at higher levels of salt. So that's an ongoing project. We're adding data, we're finding more sites, and we'll see where that whole project leads us. So the last slide is just to thank all of the undergrads who have been major contributors of the work that's come out of my lab, and sort of training the next generation of scientists who may carry on this kind of work, but most likely are going to go off to other forms of science. And then also just a final comment about the importance of the work that is being done by the Salt Watch program. So as individuals, sometimes it can feel overwhelming how to contribute to problems like this, especially when a lot of the salt application is happening by municipalities and governments. But that's one thing that's really neat about the Salt Watch program, is that you are, as sort of individuals, going out and collecting data that will be really useful in terms of identifying problem areas, the scale of the problem, trends over time, and having that data and information is really going to be a critical step in trying to begin to make changes in the way in which we add salt to our environment. And it's going to be something we have to continue to use, but to be more judicious and careful about it, especially once we understand the extent of the salt in the environment. And now, like through the work I just talked to about the extent, the impact that looks like it's going to be having on our freshwater systems. So I will stop there and pass it back to Abby.
Amy, thank you so much for such a great presentation. That was really, really awesome. We do have a couple very specific questions for you before I kick it over to Sujay. So one question from John in Oberlin, Ohio. In your monitoring, were any measurements taken of radioactivity? I assume you are aware of the controversy in Ohio over the attempts year after year to pass a bill that would permit aquasaline brine from oil and gas wells to be marketed commercially despite its high levels of radioactivity. The Ohio Department of Transportation is no longer purchasing well brine for desalting state highways, but townships are using it for de-icing and dust suppression.
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is no. I haven't been exploring radioactivity. That's a tough thing to do as a scientist. You have to have special facilities. I'm at a relatively small institution, and we don't actually have the ability to do that work here. But it's a really concerning problem. I have heard about those, about the various types of solutions that are trying to be used in the area. And so it's a really great question, but it's one in which I don't have any data for you on that one. Somebody else I see asked a question about the time scale that we did on the individual species. It's a 48-hour test, so it's a really short sort of acute toxicity. So that's a quick one I can answer to.
Great. And actually two other questions. Had there been a look at impacts on macroinvertebrates? In the direct work that I have done recently, no, but I certainly do work on macroinvertebrates, and it's a direction that I intend to look at further in the future. And it's certainly a piece that we can begin to incorporate in our survey work. But we have so far predominantly focused on the plankton communities, but I think others have, but our lab particularly has not. Great, thank you. Yep, and that other question was about timescales too. Great, thank you so much. And we will go ahead and kick it over to Sujay, but I'll introduce him first. So Dr. Sujay Koshal is a professor in the Department of Geology and Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center at the University of Maryland, College Park. He has been a professor in the University of Maryland system for 17 years. He has published over 100 scientific papers in peer-reviewed journals related to freshwater salinization, water quality, and water resources. He has taught well over 1,000 UMD undergraduate and graduate students through classes and thesis projects. Sujay, thank you for being with us here today. And I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks, Abby. Are you actually, should I share screen or do you have the presentation? Which would be better?
Yep, I have it. Can you see it?
Yeah, okay. So I'll just tell you to change the slide. Yeah.
Yep. Okay,
awesome. So thank you for having me. And this work is done with a lot of different collaborators. And Abby, as Abby mentioned, I enjoy teaching a lot, and I'm just finishing up with my first class just right now, actually. So, and we talked about freshwater salinization. Okay, so next slide. So today we'll talk about freshwater salinization syndrome. So not just freshwater salinization, which is the increasing concentrations of ions, but the different types of symptoms and constellation of different impacts that salt has in the environment. And then we'll also talk about the risks of the freshwater salinization syndrome in the environment and potentially to human health. And then what's the prognosis in terms of managing freshwater salinization syndrome? Okay, next slide. Okay. And so we'll start off with freshwater salinization syndrome. So this is an important issue from a drinking water perspective. In our region in the eastern United States and other regions, salts can get into drinking water. And so this is just an example on your upper left-hand side from a paper that we first worked on almost 20 years ago, which was showing salinization of the drinking water supply in Baltimore. And here you can see a quadrupling of the chloride concentration, chloride being a key component of salt, over 2 decades in the drinking water supply. And we predicted back then in a paper that if these trends would continue, it'd affect the potability of drinking water over the next century. Now, at that time, this was work with Bill Stack at the Department of Public Works, a key collaborator. At that time, we did have an idea that other, constituents in water, other salts, ions were increasing over time, not just sodium and chloride. But at that time, we didn't know what was causing these trends and that they were linked in some way. So next slide. So the reason why this is an issue is not only the effects of the salts directly in the environment, but they can also have indirect effects that we don't think of. For example, sodium and chloride, or chloride, can be corrosive and can actually cause corrosion in pipes and the leaching of certain metals like manganese in old cast iron pipes, copper in copper pipes, lead in some pipes with lead solders that they used to use long ago. And so these salts can strip the metals into the water from the pipes, and then that can go in drinking water. Our own home was affected by this, actually. This is an article, this is a picture of water from a pipe in 2015, 2016. I can't remember the year, but I was interviewed by the Washington Post for this article, and they were like, Sujay, what's causing the water to turn blackish brown like that? And I was talking about manganese and how sometimes you get leaching of manganese. And after the article, after the reporter was done asking questions, there was a knock at my door, and it was one of our neighbors. And this was a couple hours afterwards, and he was like, Sujay, have you noticed that the water have you noticed that our water is turning brownish black? Have you noticed that in your water? And then we put two and two together in our heads that basically this phenomenon was affecting our water at home. And, I had my son was probably 3 or 4 years old, and little kids are about 90% water. And, some of these metals like manganese can be neurotoxins. And, I went to Home Depot and we got like a reverse osmosis system. So this is a problem that literally hit home for me, but in the Midwest, right? So the Flint, Michigan issue is very complex, and there was a lot of different things that were covered by the media. But one of the issues was the switching of the water to the Flint River, which was enriched with chlorides, due to road salt and other pollution. Those chlorides are corrosive, and they interact with the lead and the surface lines. You can add corrosion inhibitors, but it's very difficult once the water, sometimes we test the water at the treatment plant, but when it goes in the distribution system, it's difficult to test some of those impacts and how it's interacting with the pipes. So corrosive water, its interactions with lead and copper and manganese are very, very important. So next slide. Our work has started off in Baltimore, and as I mentioned before, we started looking at sodium and chloride increasing trends, how that was affecting drinking water. Then we started realizing that, okay, it's linked to other things in the environment. And we eventually started looking up and down the East Coast, and then across the country, and then globally. And these are just a few examples of some of the work that we've done. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see sodium concentrations. So sodium is a concern. It's not regulated, but there's concerns about sodium in drinking water with people with hypertension. Some studies have been done on that in the Philadelphia drinking water supply. You can see sodium concentrations rising over time. In the left-hand side, you see a heat map or a salt map of the United States, where the red patterns that you see are the fastest rates of increasing salinity in the United States. Where we live in the mid-Atlantic, there's a little patch of red because we have increasing trends driven by changes in land use, road salts, but also wastewater inputs, fertilizers, and also the breakdown of concrete in the built environment. That also releases salts into the environment as well. And then on the right, your lower right corner, you'll see increasing chloride trends for world rivers. Some of these trends that we've seen are not just in areas where they apply road salt. There's actually increasing trends in salt ions in Puerto Rico. You see them in Japan. You see them, we've documented them in South America or reviewed them and synthesized them. So they're happening in some of these other areas as well for different reasons, like wastewater inputs, fertilizers, all that. But the point is that this freshwater salinization issue is something that's happening locally, regionally, over the North American continent, and then also globally. Okay, next slide. And these are just some examples of increasing concentrations of different salt ions. So initially the work focused on sodium and chloride, but now we know that calcium, magnesium, potassium, and other salt ions are increasing as well. They're not just increasing in the Northeast, they can increase in Texas, Alabama, Georgia. It's not happening with every stream in the United States, but it's happening with some major rivers and streams and drinking water supplies. And so it's impacting different salt ions on a very large scale. And the scope and magnitude of the salinization issue is much greater than what we ever anticipated, years ago. And these different ions can have different water quality impacts in the environment. Okay, next slide. So we came up with a concept that we call the freshwater salinization syndrome, which is basically, it describes the causes and consequences of salts, of increased salinization. So it first starts off with your local geology, what type of geology that you have in the environment. And, if you have sedimentary rocks, or if you have what's called crystalline lithology from other types of rocks, how those rocks break down affect the background salinity in the stream. And also the rainwater also affects the salinity. We have documented rising trends in sodium and chloride in some regions of the United States, potentially due to aerosolization of road salts into the atmosphere or other sources. And so what happens with the rain and what happens with the rocks in the geology, they affect the background salinity, okay? And they can be those based on, they're kind of like risk factors for developing freshwater salinization syndrome. And then you can have human inputs from brines, resource extraction, road salts, sewage, that can affect the salts that are in the water. And then if you look at the outputs, what goes out in the river, you can have these increasing trends of electrical conductivity or specific conductivity, which is the ability of the water to conduct electric current, which is affected by salts, changes in pH, changes in salt ion concentrations. This can affect the drinking water process, drinking water quality. It can affect what's delivered, the acid neutralizing capacity delivered to the coastal zone. It has some very far-reaching effects when we're accelerating the transport or disrupting the salt cycle from the land to the receiving waters. Okay, next slide. There's different risk factors for developing freshwater salinization syndrome, and we've been studying this recently, and this is from a global review of different risk factors. Climate, geology, human activities, flow paths, and time are important in terms of risk factors for which regions are going to be affected by the salts. So if you have a very dry climate, that can affect it. Like I said before, the type of geology, if the rocks break down very easily, they produce salts. Human activities like irrigation, agriculture, road salting, the flow paths of water, whether there's impoundments or whether it goes through wetlands, and then time, how long these processes operate. And just like if you have like risk for heart disease or risks for diabetes, it's very important to know the risk factors for certain watersheds and their potential for developing this condition. Okay, next slide. So we'll talk about some of these risks, okay? And next slide. So this is a salt pile, just a picture from the highway in our region, and then from a salt facility that I visited a couple of years ago. Next slide. So one of the emerging risks of freshwater salinization syndrome is the mobilization of different chemical cocktails or mixtures of different novel combinations of different elements in the environment that are chemicals of concern. Next slide. So one of them is nitrogen. So this is work from Shahan Haq, a former graduate student in our lab, where he did these experiments where he added different levels of salt to streams, mud from the bottom of streams. And he found that the more salt that he added, the more nitrogen that was released from the mud into the water. Nitrogen is really important because it's like a fertilizer. So in the Chesapeake Bay region, there's concerns about excess nitrogen going to Chesapeake Bay, growing algal blooms that then die and then consume oxygen at the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay, leading to dead zones. So there's a potential link between these salts and then making nutrient pollution worse by mobilizing nitrogen from the environment to downstream waters. Next slide. There are freshwater salinization can also mobilize metals as well. And, when we did these experiments, we saw a mobilization of manganese, copper, strontium. Others have seen zinc, cadmium. And so the more salt that you add, you see these increasing patterns of all these different metals that are being released into water as well. And these are also contaminants of concern. And I was listening to the questions in Amy's talk, and there was a question about radionuclides. People have now found that sodium can also mobilize radionuclides like radium in the environment. So there's some real potential health concerns associated with the mobilization of these different metals into waters, particularly those source waters that are drinking water supplies for people. Next slide. And we found that specific conductance, or basically the ability of the water to conduct electricity, is related strongly to a variety of different contaminants that we see in the environment, which suggests that this is some examples from near the drinking water intake for the Potomac River, which is our largest drinking water supply in the DC area, and also some streams that we see on campus. But basically salts can be strongly related to a variety of different contaminants through mobilization processes, which we've looked at through experiments in the lab. So even though the salt is being mobilized, there's a question about what other contaminants are also being mobilized along with the salt that we need to think about. Next slide. And so this is an example of the formation of different chemical cocktails in the environment. Salt can affect, we found through experiments and through monitoring, that salts can affect different chemical cocktails that end up in our streams and rivers and in our drinking water supplies related to metals, other salts, nutrients, and also organic matter, which is important because when they treat drinking water, the quality of the organic matter that's in the system can interact with chlorine to form disinfection byproducts. So salt has the potential to affect a wide variety of different chemical cocktails in the environment, but our knowledge of some of these effects is still in its infancy, and we're still discovering more and more impacts in the environment to other chemicals besides the salt itself. Next slide. So we had a student, Carly Moss, who put together this table, and it was a really great table that Carly put together, and it was of the potential health implications associated with these different salts. We need salts in our body because they control our heartbeat, our muscle contractions, our muscle relaxation. They're there's something that physiologically we need the salts in the environment. And, people drink Gatorade and these energy drinks, which are enriched in salts, but at a certain point, too much salt is not good for you. And if there's too much of a certain type of ion, it can actually be toxic. So there's a lot of potential health implications associated with some of these salt ions and the chemical cocktails that they mobilize in the environment. But more work needs to be done on some of these health implications. Okay, next slide. So the last thing that I'll talk about is managing our prospects for managing freshwater salinization syndrome. Okay, next slide. So one of the things that we're blessed with on the University of Maryland campus, in fact, we were walking there today with some collaborators, is that we have some streams running through the campus. And we study these, we figure out all kinds of ways to study these streams, whether we sample them day and night or walk up and down the stream. And one of the things that we do is we sample them during different years. And in gold is a year 2020 where we had the pandemic, and in Maryland we had a low snow or no snow year where there just wasn't snow that year. And we had over 100-fold decrease in the sodium concentrations that whole year when no or low road salt was applied to the UMD campus. So we know during low salt years, we can see an impact on the concentrations in these small watersheds where we know something about the salting practices. So that gives us some hope that, when you reduce these salt concentrations, it can affect there, you can see an improvement. You can also see a reduction in some of the other chemicals that are mobilized by the salt this year, where they were also lower. So that, like I said, reducing the amounts of salt can have an impact, an impact on reducing what you see in the stream and other contaminants of concern. Okay, next slide. This was a figure put together by actually our lab manager and a former student of mine. And actually her father got an email about Salt Watch, and she emailed me about this. She was so excited. She's like, Sujay, have you heard about this program? And I was like, yes, Ruth, I have. So this is from Ruth Shotkai. And basically this is a figure conveying that, freshwater salinization syndrome it's a constellation of different symptoms in the environment that has risk factors that we've talked about, but it also has stages. And understanding these stages, just like hypertension and diabetes and all that, is really important to know your risk factors. A couple of years ago, had very high, not very high, but high blood sugar, because I used to like to eat sweets. I still like to eat sweets, actually. But, my wife, who's a pediatrician, saw my blood sugar numbers, and she's like, oh, you need to get this A1C test. So anyway, we looked up where my values were, and I realized I know what my risk factors are. And I was able to look up and see what level I was at, and what stage I was at with like pre-diabetes and all that. So then I cut out, I don't eat as much sugar, right? I saw an improvement. If you don't know where you're at in terms of these different levels, you never know, what kind of treatment or how to prioritize the treatment or that sort of thing. So stage 0 is where you have no effects. Stage 1 is where you have, one ion increasing over one season. Stage 2 is where you get chronic level effects. Stage 3 is where you get harmful chemical cocktails in the environment forming. Stage 4 is where you get surpassing some threshold that's really critical for water quality, like aquatic life or good drinking water. And the streams and rivers where we live are often in stage 3 or 4. We can diagnose that by looking at high frequency sensor data in these streams and looking at what chemical cocktails are formed, and then what percentage of the time of the year that certain thresholds are reached. So we can manage freshwater salinization by the amounts, like from the previous slide, and we can treat it by knowing something about the risk factors and the stages, and then using different types of salt ions along flow paths, which I don't have time to present that work, but the types of salts that we use, the types of stormwater management that we use, those play a role in managing freshwater salinization syndrome as well. Next slide. So the implications are that freshwater salinization syndrome is increasing from local to global scales. It's not just a small scale problem, it's a global problem now. Freshwater salinization syndrome poses risks to drinking water and health. Freshwater salinization syndrome can be managed by source reductions, also managing the types of salts that are applied and where you apply them in the watershed. Like I said, I didn't have time to go into everything, but this is just an overview. Next slide. There's always people to thank, many, many students in our lab and people that we work with very closely for many, many years, and our funding agencies. And thanks, Abby, for inviting us. That's it.
Sujay, thank you so much for your presentation. And Amy, thank you for your presentation. I know we're a little bit over time, and that's okay. I talked a little bit too much at the beginning. We do have a couple of questions. So I'll start us off here. And I think I can mostly answer this one. And then Sujay, if you have anything to add, or Amy, if you have anything to add to these two, please chime in. So one question is, there are several alternative materials for quote unquote salt being sold for de-icing sidewalks. Are they significantly less harmful to drinking water, etc., than just plain salt. So this is something I can answer. There are a lot of different things being sold. So things like PAW or eco-friendly salt. A lot of those they still contain salt. They might have different mixtures of salt in them, but there's no regulation on the packaging of materials that you're seeing in the stores. There are some other materials like acetates that are supposed to be more environmentally neutral than chlorides are. But they tend to be a lot more expensive too. So I don't know if Sujay or Amy, if either of you want to add anything to that.
I would say that, yeah, the expense, like, they also use magnesium chloride, which they're effective at different temperatures, and sometimes they use magnesium chloride on sidewalks and stuff. They just have different effects in terms of corrosion potential and all that too. But the expense is rock salt, sodium chloride is very cheap compared to like magnesium chloride, and acetate is more expensive. So yeah, but they do have different potentials in terms of mobilizing contaminants, actually.
And one other question, concerns over using wood charcoal. That used to be a thing out in Western Maryland. From my understanding, that causes a lot of nutrients to go into the environment and can create some eutrophication events. And same thing with like fertilizers. A lot of those do contain chlorides too. Please do not salt with fertilizers. But when you're putting them on your yard during the springtime or summer, those can also contribute as well. Same thing, try to not use any products that contain urea too. Chloride is easy to test for using salt watch strips. Are there other simple ways to test for other ions to consider what chemical cocktails might be present?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really great question. I think monitoring, like going on Amazon and getting like a total dissolved solids meter or like a conductivity meter, it's worth it to do that, because usually when you can look up online like what the ranges of conductivity your water should be. And when you get into those higher ranges of like moderate to poor water quality, that other ions are being mobilized, and that, it's that it's an issue. So in addition to the salt watch strips, which are great, it's probably good to get a TDS meter, total dissolved solids meter, to do that.
And another question, why not urea? Same thing, it has nutrients in it that can cause some eutrophication events. Let's see. Other questions?
There's one in the question and answer section, Abby. There's a few. Is there a negative impact from anthropogenic salt sources getting into estuarine brackish rivers? A lot of folks are monitoring in the Chesapeake watershed, so that's a concern.
Yeah, that's a really good question too. The tributary, these are really great questions. So you would think that there wouldn't be, because it's saltier water, but some of the salts that are carried in the water are alkaline, like carbonates, and they're enriched in what are called the base cations, so they can affect the pH of the water. So there's actually been an increasing trends in pH at the mouths of those rivers going into the Chesapeake, and you also see them in some other estuaries on the East Coast. And I don't know if anybody on this call has like a home aquarium, but when you get a high pH in the water, you can sometimes turn ammonium into ammonia, where the ammonia is toxic. So there are some issues that sometimes happen when there's higher pH water, where it can affect certain, ammonia toxicity or certain blooms of algae and that sort of thing that are an issue. So the salt itself, I'm not sure, but the pH change associated with it, which we do see at the mouths of some of these rivers, may be an issue,
Amy, a couple questions for you. Was there an effort to measure the time sequence between injection and mortality? Salt is often a pulse-based pollutant and can be relatively transient and diluted upon entry to a water system. Just curious.
Well, the experiments we did in the tanks and enclosures, that's the difference between sort of running water like streams and rivers and ponds and lakes. So we added the salts to those systems and it stayed. It doesn't go anywhere. It's not being flushed out of the system. So from the experimental standpoint, we established the communities, we measured plankton before we added salt, we added the salt, and we monitored multiple times over like a 6-week period. So the experiments were exposed for long periods of time. And the shorter ones, the ones we do in the lab that are these sort of more standard ecological tests, there's kind of a standard protocol that's often used to test toxicity, specific concentrations of chemicals that are toxic for different organisms. The standard is typically a 48-hour exposure. So you expose them to a concentration in a tube. So you put them in the tube with the concentration, they're exposed to it for 48 hours straight, and then you measure the response. That doesn't necessarily reflect, you know, what that's a level that you would translate directly into what's safe in natural systems. A 48-hour acute toxicity test is like death in 48 hours. You can have much lower concentrations that would be toxic over longer periods of time or would prevent reproduction or slow growth rates. So it's kind of like the extreme test that tells you this level is toxic, will kill, but you can have a lot of effects that are lower than that. So it's absolutely true that there are these pulsed exposures, but that's especially true in these running water systems. And we didn't really look at the temporal impacts because of the nature of us, like kind of looking at these lakes and ponds where it tends to just accumulate and not be as pulsed of an effect.
A couple more questions. For a place like Maryland, and given that our climate will get significantly warmer in the coming decades, how much longer do you anticipate the road salt problem to stay relevant?
I'm guessing that's for me, but that's a good question. I've been wondering that myself. We were out in the field today and I was enjoying the weather. And, you know, we've talked about this, and some people think that the weather in Maryland is also variable. So there's like wet and dry years. And then, you know, some years we'll have a mild winter, some years we'll have a heavy winter, and the climate variability is increasing. And actually we've written papers showing that like some of our Potomac records for stream flow, the USGS has measured them since the 1890s. And the stream flow has become more variable since the 1970s. So it could be that you get situations where you have more snow delivered over short, intense burst periods, you know, over time with the increasing climate variability that we know that we're seeing in the region. But I don't know. I hope that it gets warmer. I would love to. I mean, I shouldn't say this on this call, but yeah, I mean, climate. We don't know the answer to that, but their climate variability could be an issue too. So.
What happens to road salt, which ends up in soil rather than runoff? Does it remain in solution? Can it be flushed? We typically see much higher concentrations of salt in streams in summer rather than winter when salt is being applied.
We've seen that too. Yeah, a lot of the sodium, there's exchange sites on the soil that are negatively charged clays and organic matter, and then the sodium will attach to that and then stick onto it, and chloride can also build up. So how long does it take to flush out? That's a good question. It depends on the soil. You know, I mean, in the first slide I showed you with the Baltimore drinking water supply data, basically there's a chronic condition where the baseline salinity in the system was increasing. It wasn't just during the winter months. So in some cases it could take, you know, maybe decades to flush out, but in other cases it may be flushed out over more quicker timescales depending on the soils and the flow paths of the water.
And I can add on to that too, from my understanding as well, salt in the soil, it tends to compact a lot of the soil too, which can sometimes interfere with plant life, which is sometimes one of the reasons why you're seeing some desiccation of plants along sidewalks and things, although there's different processes involved in all of that. Woody asks, does WSSC measure conductivity and total dissolved solids on a routine basis? And if so, are the data available on a public website, such as like the EPA? I believe that data is available on their website. And I think that you can find it, and they do measure it on a regular basis. I'm not sure. I think they have probes. I don't know if you know more, Sujay.
Yeah, they do. They measure it routinely. They may have, we were just talking, I mean, they may have sensors or putting in sensors to measure it continuously. Yeah.
Oh, and Emily, who is our former Salt Watch person, just mentioned that in the past, for a former question, IWLA hosted a webinar with info on the impacts of salt on soil and vegetation. So you can actually view that on our website. 2 more questions. How effective are reverse osmosis systems for home drinking water?
I don't know if Amy wants to,
No, I'm not an expert on that.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't.
They're effective, but they're expensive.
Yeah.
So that generally is the problem, is we have the solutions, but the expense gets in the way.
And last question, what, if anything, chemical should be used to make icy conditions less slippery? I assume that fine dirt or grit as mechanical friction is fine. I can start this off. So we're not asking for a total ban on using road salt. We're just asking for folks to be more mindful about how much salt that you're using. You can use dirt or grit as a bit of traction, but that has a whole host of other issues like sedimentation effects in waterways and can clog storm drains and things too. So no matter what you're using, again, trying to shovel early and often, scatter that salt. Your mug, one 12-ounce drinking mug is enough to salt 10 sidewalk squares or 20 feet of driveway, and then trying to sweep up whatever you put down afterwards too is really important. And I don't know if either of you would like to add any other great things that you can do or use in the winter time.
There's one thing I'd like to say, which is that, you know, many of these issues, they stem from like how much parking lot pavement, like impervious surface that we put down, because you have to treat the roadway, and then you know, the roadway, when it breaks apart, it releases ions into the water too. And maybe not sodium chloride, but other ions. So, you know, conservation is so key. You know, like I was just talking to the students in this intro geology class about the movie Wall-E. I don't know if anybody in this call has seen that. It's kind of a cute Disney movie about like Earth not being inhabitable and all that. The thing is, we have a lot of natural lands still available, or low residential lands that are being developed all the time. And I think better zoning and those types of things are really important. And there are probably ways to get involved. Like we've had things near our campus where people have spoken up about that. And I think that limiting the amount, like trying to do better, you know, just conservation, like I will say, you know, Benjamin Franklin said like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So we'll be continually having this conversation if we keep developing in the ways that we did in the past. And you know, we need to think about where we put the development and the extent of it and how we do it, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we've developed a model with a student, sort of a GIS model that's used to try and predict which local sites are more or less likely to have lots of salt. We're looking at like ponds and lakes versus streams. And predictive factors are things like amount of impervious surface within a certain area. So it's absolutely, that's like the main source, except in our area, agriculture also can have an effect. But yeah, I think that's a great point that you bring up, Sujay.
I mean, it would be great if they used your model, Amy, and like guiding like zoning and planning and like where to like further develop. I mean, that would be so cool if they were able to use like a scientific model to guide or to predict impacts or something like that. That's what we need, but I don't know how they would, if they ever do that, let me know, because I'd love
Yeah.
to.
So this started off as a student project. It seems pretty interesting. It's not yet sort of automated to be used on a bigger scale, but it's sort of, this is a particular student who's planning to go on to grad school. So it's the sort of thing that I think could be a really useful tool. Somebody may be developing this and working on it. We were just trying to make something useful for our local areas. But the point is, we can learn a lot about what our landscapes are doing and can use that to predict where salt will end up, and that might help us sort of develop new areas and maybe fix our existing developed areas to make them less problematic from a road salt perspective.
It's very cool.
So I think those are all of our questions. Thank you both very much for joining us today. You both have so much knowledge, and I'm glad that we're able to share that. Oh, one more question snuck in. Sujay, I think one of your students or a couple of your students may have done some research on this. Are there plants that could or should soak up salt? And Amy, I don't know if you have students who have done research on this topic.
I may defer to Amy, but I will say that we have had some students that did a literature review on halophytes, and their ability to take up salts and like some of the thresholds, but I'll turn it over to Amy if she knows more about that.
Well, yeah, I am sort of more of the ecologist biologist of the two of us, probably. And I know that there are examples where we can use salts to remediate sort of toxic chemicals at sites, but I'm not, I don't know that I know much about salt. The problem with it is it creates an osmotic problem for the plants, so that if the soils are really salty, they can't take up water. So generally speaking, we don't get a lot of plants that can grow in really salty soils. It's actually a problem with our agricultural systems. So there might be something there that I don't know about, but salty soils is another problem as a consequence of excess salt in the environment.
Thank you. Well, thank you both very much for being here today, taking time out of your busy schedule. Sujay running directly from a class to jump onto this webinar. We really appreciate you being here. And also thank you to Samantha Briggs for being in sort of the background and making sure that the webinar was running smoothly and letting everyone in and everything. So, and thank you to all of our volunteers, everyone who is able to join us here today. And thanks for letting us run over a little bit too, to answer all of your questions. So thank you all. And this webinar will be recorded, or has been recorded, and it'll be available shortly on our YouTube and then also on our website as well, saltwatch.org. So thank you all and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.